The town of Green Hollow had always been quiet, tucked away from highways and bustling cities. It was a place where the air grew crisp in October, and every street seemed to hum with the anticipation of Halloween. People would string up decorations, carve pumpkins, and gather to share ghost stories around fire pits. For Matthew, Halloween was his favorite time of the year. But this year, something felt different. As he wandered through the streets after school, he noticed a new shop at the end of Main Street. It hadn't been there yesterday, and yet, its presence felt as if it had always been part of the town. The sign above the door read, "Hollow's End, Costumes and Curiosities." The letters were painted in a faded, weathered gold, and the windows were fogged, revealing only shadows of what lay inside. Intrigued, Matthew stepped closer. The door creaked open, almost as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, the shop was dimly lit by flickering candles, casting long shadows across shelves lined with costumes. The air had a musty scent, a mix of old fabric and something metallic he couldn't place. Each costume seemed more detailed than the last, elaborate, almost lifelike. But there was something unsettling about them, as if the eyes of the masks followed his every move. A woman stood behind the counter, her face partially hidden beneath a veil. She was tall, her skin pale as parchment, and she smiled when Matthew entered. Looking for something special, she asked, her voice low and melodic. Matthew hesitated. "I need a costume for Halloween." The woman gestured to the racks. "You've come to the right place. Every costume here is one of a kind. Try one on, and you'll never be the same." Matthew's fingers brushed against the fabric of a cloak. It was dark, heavier than it looked, and the material felt cold under his touch. He wasn't sure why, but the cloak seemed to call to him. Without thinking, he lifted it off the hanger and held it up to himself. The woman nodded approvingly. "That one," she said softly. "It suits you." Matthew didn't question it. He took the cloak into the small fitting room in the back, the curtain closing behind him with a soft whoosh. The moment he draped the cloak over his shoulders, a strange sensation washed over him, a heaviness, as though the air around him had thickened. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized his reflection. His eyes seemed darker, his face more angular, and the cloak seemed to cling to him like a second skin. Suddenly, the world outside the fitting room felt distant, muffled. He could no longer hear the soft hum of the town or even the ticking of the shop's clock. A creeping unease spread through him, but when he tried to take the cloak off, his fingers fumbled. It wouldn't budge. Panic set in. He pulled harder, but the fabric seemed to resist, tightening around him. It was then that he heard the woman's voice, soft but clear through the walls. "Once chosen, the costume becomes part of you. Be careful, young man. The cloak carries more than just its weight." Matthew stumbled out of the fitting room, the cloak still wrapped tightly around him. The woman was nowhere to be seen, and the shop seemed darker than before. Shadows stretched along the walls, and the once inviting flicker of the candles now felt ominous. Something was very wrong. Matthew hurried out of the shop, his heart pounding in his chest, but once outside, the streets of Green Hollow were eerily still. The bright, festive decorations he had seen earlier now appeared dim, their colors muted under a thickening twilight. The air felt colder, sharper, and the usual laughter of children playing in the distance was gone, replaced by a strange silence that pressed in on him. The cloak clung to his skin. It was as if it had fused to him, growing heavier with each step. His hands trembled as he pulled at it again, but the fabric only seemed to tighten, molding itself to his body. His reflection in the shop window caught his eye. His face was pale, drawn. The person looking back at him wasn't the carefree young man he had been only hours ago. His eyes, once bright, were now shadowed, as if something inside him was draining away. He looked back at the shop, but it seemed darker now, as though the building itself had receded into the shadows. The sign above the door was barely visible, and the windows were completely black, as if the shop had already closed, vanished. Had he imagined it all? The woman, the strange fitting room, the way the cloak had wrapped itself around him? He took a step back, uncertain, and then another. The street lights flickered on, casting long, unnatural shadows that stretched along the ground like skeletal hands. The sensation of being watched prickled at the back of his neck. He turned sharply, half expecting to see someone following him, but the street was empty. A hollow laugh echoed from somewhere behind him, faint and distant, as if carried by the wind. Matthew's fingers brushed the fabric of the cloak once more. It felt alive. It shifted under his touch, subtly, like it was breathing. His pulse quickened. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to go home, to lock himself inside and hide until morning, but the pull of the cloak was stronger. Every step he took away from the shop felt heavier, as though something was anchoring him, urging him to stay. By the time he reached the corner of his street, the cloak had settled into a weight he could barely carry. He stumbled into the narrow alleyway beside his house, his breathing labored, his vision blurring at the edges. The trees lining the street seemed to bend toward him, their branches twisting in the wind like fingers reaching out. He tried to focus, to shake off the growing dread that gnawed at him, but it was impossible. His thoughts were muddled, drifting in and out of clarity. Suddenly, he heard footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. They echoed from the alleyway, slow, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was approaching didn't need to rush. Matthew's breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, his heart thudding against his ribcage. A figure emerged from the shadows. Cloaked, much like himself, but taller, more imposing. The person's face was hidden beneath a hood, but their presence filled the space with an oppressive silence. The figure stopped a few feet from him, unmoving, as if studying him from beneath the heavy fabric. Matthew's mouth was dry. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. The figure raised a hand, long fingers curling slowly. There was no sound, no voice, yet the meaning was clear: follow. He shook his head, stumbling backward, his feet barely moving under the weight of the cloak. No, he whispered, though it came out more like a plea than a defiance. But even as he said it, his body betrayed him. His legs carried him forward, not back, drawn toward the figure like a moth to a flame. The figure turned, gliding soundlessly toward the deeper part of the alleyway, where the light from the street lamps barely reached. Matthew tried to stop, to resist, but the cloak pulled him forward. He had no choice. His body no longer belonged to him. As they moved deeper into the shadows, a thought crept into his mind, dark and insistent. This was more than a costume. It was a curse, a binding. And whatever this figure was, whatever it wanted, it had him now. The alley grew narrower, darker, the walls closing in on either side as Matthew followed the cloaked figure. His mind screamed for him to turn back, to run, but his body betrayed him, each step dragging him further into the suffocating blackness. The air thickened around him, heavy with the smell of damp earth and rot, yet there was a stillness to it, a silence that felt unnatural. The figure ahead moved without sound, gliding effortlessly through the alley, its long cloak brushing against the ground without a whisper. Matthew could barely keep up. His legs felt like they were sinking into the ground with every step, as though the weight of the cloak was pulling him down, deeper into the earth. The further they went, the less familiar the surroundings became. He had walked these streets for years, knew every corner of Green Hollow, but now they twisted into strange, unfamiliar shapes. The buildings loomed taller, the shadows stretched longer, and the sky above seemed to vanish entirely, swallowed by a darkness that pressed in from all sides. He glanced back, but the entrance to the alley had disappeared, replaced by a wall of shadow. Panic swelled in his chest. This wasn't just a dark alley in his quiet town. It was something else, somewhere else. The figure ahead stopped abruptly, and for a brief moment, Matthew's legs obeyed him. He stood frozen, staring at the back of the figure, his breath shallow and quick. "Where are we?" Matthew finally managed to ask, his voice trembling in the thick silence. The figure turned slowly, its face still hidden beneath the hood. When it spoke, its voice was soft but clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You are where the cloak has brought you, and where it will keep you." A chill ran down Matthew's spine. He tried to speak again, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, filling the narrow alley with an oppressive weight. Matthew could feel the pull of the cloak tighten, as if it were responding to the figure's nearness, binding him more tightly with each breath. "You chose this," the figure said softly, its voice carrying an eerie calm. "You put it on." Matthew shook his head, his heart pounding. "I didn't know. I didn't understand." The figure tilted its head slightly, a gesture almost of pity, but there was no kindness in the movement. "Few do. But the choice is made, nonetheless." The ground beneath Matthew's feet shifted, softening as if the earth itself was turning to liquid. He stumbled, trying to keep his balance, but the cloak weighed him down, pulling him into the softening ground. Panic surged through him. He tugged at the cloak, desperate to free himself, but the fabric was unyielding, binding him like a second skin. His legs sank deeper, the ground swallowing him inch by inch. His breath quickened, his chest tightening as he clawed at the cloak, but it was no use. The figure watched silently, unmoving, as Matthew was pulled further into the ground. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The ground beneath him solidified once more, and the pull of the cloak eased. Matthew gasped, his body trembling with the effort of standing. The figure remained, still and silent, its presence looming over him like a shadow. "Let me go," Matthew whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. The figures had shifted, and though he couldn't see its face, Matthew felt its gaze settle on him, cold and unwavering. "The cloak is part of you now. Wherever you go, it will follow. You cannot escape it." Matthew's mind raced. The cloak, the shop, the strange woman, none of it made sense, and yet it was happening. He could feel the weight of the cloak clinging to him, the strange pull in the pit of his stomach that told him this was more than just a costume. It was something far darker, something he couldn't control. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure turned away, its cloak swirling in the darkness. "You will understand," it said, its voice drifting back to them like a distant echo. "In time." And with that, the figure vanished, swallowed by the shadows, leaving Matthew alone in the alley, the weight of the cloak pressing down on him like a curse. As Matthew stumbled back onto the street, the familiar town of Green Hollow seemed distorted, as if he was seeing it through a warped lens. The buildings, normally quaint and small, now towered over him, their windows dark and empty like the vacant eyes of giants. The chill in the air wasn't just October's creeping cold, it was something deeper, something that made him feel utterly alone. The cloak clung to his shoulders, its weight now more oppressive than ever. He had tried, several times, to rip it off, to pull the fabric over his head and cast it aside, but each time, his hands faltered, as though the cloak had woven itself into his very skin. Every tug felt like pulling at his own flesh. The edges of his vision wavered, and strange whispers seemed to rise in the wind, voices that were too faint to understand but too clear to ignore. His mind raced. The figure's words echoed, "The cloak is part of you now." What did that mean? And why had he chosen that costume in the first place? Matthew tried to think back to his time in the shop, but the memory was blurry, like trying to recall a fading dream. He remembered the woman's unsettling smile, the way she had watched him as though she knew more about him than he knew about himself. But beyond that, there was a blank space where the memory should have been. Something shifted within him, an awareness, faint but growing. The cloak didn't just weigh him down, it was affecting him, twisting his thoughts, his very perception of reality. As he walked through the streets, people passed by, but their faces were strange, their expressions hollow. The town, which had always been a safe, quiet place, now felt unfamiliar, hostile even. A sudden urge gripped him to return to the shop, to demand answers. He quickened his pace, but every step felt heavier than the last. The building seemed to stretch and bend as if the entire world was tilting, but he pressed on. If he could just reach the shop, if he could just find the woman, maybe he could stop whatever was happening. But when he turned the corner onto the street where the shop had been, there was nothing. No sign of the dark storefront, no glowing jack-o'-lanterns in the window. The alley was gone, replaced by a row of ordinary shops, all of them closed for the night. Panic surged in his chest. Had he imagined it all? No, that wasn't possible. The cloak was real, its weight, its pull, the strange whispers that now seemed to hum just below the surface of his consciousness. Matthew spun around, searching the darkened street for any sign of the mysterious shop. His heart pounded against his ribs, and sweat slicked his palms despite the chill in the air. But there was nothing. The alley, the shop, the woman, it had all vanished as if it had never existed. For a moment, he stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The whispers in his mind grew louder, insistent, like distant voices calling his name from the dark. He looked down at the cloak, its black fabric now seeming to pulse with a life of its own, as though it was breathing, drawing him in with each steady inhale. "I need to get this off," he muttered to himself, his voice barely more than a whisper. He turned back toward his house, hoping that somehow, in the safety of his own room, he could find a way to free himself. But as he walked, the town seemed to twist further out of shape. The streets were unfamiliar now, the paths winding in directions they had never gone before. Street lights flickered in and out, casting long, jagged shadows that danced at the edges of his vision. Matthew felt like he was walking through a maze, every turn leading him deeper into a place that wasn't Green Hollow anymore. And with every step, the cloak grew tighter, the whispers louder. He could no longer tell where they were coming from, were they in his mind, or was something out there, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, waiting for him? His house appeared ahead, but it didn't feel like home. The windows were dark, the front door looming larger than it should. For a moment, he hesitated, a deep sense of unease washing over him. It was as if the cloak knew something he didn't, as if it was trying to warn him of what awaited inside. But he had no choice. He couldn't stay out here, lost in a town that no longer made sense. Gathering what little courage he had left, Matthew pushed open the door and stepped into the cold, silent house. The air inside the house was different, thicker, almost oppressive. Matthew closed the door behind him and stood in the entryway, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. It was his house, but not the way he remembered it. The familiar shapes of furniture and walls seemed distant, like faded memories of a place he once knew. He reached for the light switch, but his hand hesitated. Something deep within him resisted the idea of illuminating the space, as if the darkness held some fragile sense of order. Flicking the switch would unravel it, expose something he wasn't ready to face. Instead, he moved cautiously down the hallway, his footsteps muffled on the carpet, the whispering of the cloak following him like a shadow. In the mirror by the stairs, his reflection flickered in the dim light. Matthew stopped, staring at himself. The cloak hung from his shoulders, draped like a shroud, and his face, pale and gaunt, was barely recognizable. His eyes, once bright and full of life, seemed hollow. There was something else there, too, a faint outline, almost imperceptible at first, but as he stared, it became clearer. Another face, hidden beneath his own, layered like an old mask that had begun to peel away. Panic seized him. He rubbed his eyes, hoping it was just a trick of the shadows, but when he looked again, the face lingered. It was older, more angular, with dark, deep-set eyes that seemed to mock his every movement. His breath came faster, and the cloak tightened around him, as though feeding off his fear. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." He tore his gaze from the mirror and stumbled up the stairs, his body feeling heavier with each step. The house creaked around him, the familiar sounds now warped, as though the very walls were shifting. Every corner seemed sharper, every shadow longer. By the time he reached his bedroom door, his limbs felt leaden, the whispers in his mind merging into a low, indistinguishable hum. He threw open the door and collapsed onto the bed, gasping for breath. The cloak still clung to him, its fabric cool against his skin, but now it felt less like clothing and more like an extension of himself. As if removing it would be like tearing away a piece of his own body. He tugged at the collar, but his fingers slipped, unable to find purchase on the smooth, seamless fabric. "Why can't I take it off?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a rasp. His heart pounded against his ribs, and the panic that had been a distant undercurrent now surged to the surface. Desperation clawed at him. The room around him shifted again, subtly at first, but then with a more deliberate motion, as though the space itself was breathing. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down on him. A faint pressure built in his chest, a sensation like drowning. And through it all, the cloak remained. He looked around the room for anything that might help, a knife, scissors, something sharp. But the room was bare, stripped of its usual clutter. His phone lay on the bedside table, but when he reached for it, his hand froze. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. He felt as if something was watching him from just beyond his vision, something that would spring into view if he made the wrong move. And then, there it was, a rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the far corner of the room. Matthew's eyes flicked toward the sound, his heart pounding. In the corner, where the shadows were thickest, something shifted. A figure, no, more like a shape, seemed to emerge from the darkness, blending seamlessly with the dim light. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if it had always been there, waiting. It wore a cloak identical to Matthew's, the fabric hanging loose around its frame. But where Matthew's face had been reflected in the mirror, there was only void beneath the figure's hood. An absence, a nothingness that chilled him to his core. He wanted to scream, but the sound died in his throat. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. Matthew could feel its gaze, though it had no eyes, feel its cold breath on his skin. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "You are the mask now. There is no escape." The words wrapped around him like a noose, tightening with each syllable. Matthew's hands flew to his face, but it was no longer his. The skin beneath his fingers felt foreign, smooth and cold, like the fabric of the cloak itself. He stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him, collapsing onto the bed once more. The room began to spin, the walls closing in completely now. The figure loomed above him, its faceless presence the only constant in a world that was rapidly unraveling. "You've worn it for too long," the voice whispered, barely audible. "Now it wears you." Darkness crept in at the edges of Matthew's vision, and as the figure leaned closer, the whispers in his mind merged into one final, undeniable truth. There was no Matthew anymore. Only the mask. When Matthew woke, the world felt sharper, as if he had slipped between realities. He sat up in bed, disoriented, the memories of the night before swirling like leaves in the wind. The house was quiet, too quiet. His fingers brushed the fabric of the cloak still wrapped around his shoulders, the sensation smooth and almost comforting now. He no longer tried to remove it. Something had shifted, deep inside him, a hollow space where his thoughts should have been. He rose from the bed, moving with a calmness that was unfamiliar, unnatural. His movements felt deliberate, yet detached, as if someone else were pulling the strings. Downstairs, the house remained cloaked in shadows, but they no longer bothered him. The mirror in the hallway, the same one that had revealed the unsettling reflection the night before, now showed only a faint outline. His own face, once sharp, familiar, had faded. It was no longer clear where Matthew began and the mask ended. He stared at the reflection, his fingers tracing the edge of the cloak, but there was no emotion, no fear, no confusion. Only acceptance. The doorbell rang. For a moment, Matthew stood frozen, unsure of whether the sound was real. But it came again, sharp, insistent. Mechanically, he moved toward the front door, each step measured, his senses dulled. When he opened it, the October chill swept in, carrying with it a strange sense of familiarity. Outside, two children in Halloween costumes stood on the porch. A little witch with a pointed hat, and beside her, a pirate, his plastic sword dangling from his belt. Their faces lit up with innocent excitement, unaware of the strange presence before them. "Trick or treat," the witch squeaked, holding out a small pumpkin-shaped basket. Matthew blinked, his mind slow to catch up. He looked down at himself, the cloak draped over his body, the smooth fabric seeming to ripple in the soft breeze. His hand, pale and cold, reached out automatically, but he had nothing to offer them. The children shifted, their smiles faltering, sensing something off. The pirate's grin faded, his eyes widening as he looked up at Matthew's hooded figure. Who are you?" the pirate whispered, his voice trembling. Matthew paused. The words struck him, a question that seemed to cut through the fog in his mind. Who was he? The answer hung in the air, just beyond his reach. The children stared up at him, their innocent faces twisting with unease. The witch took a small step back, pulling her friend with her. He wanted to say something, anything, to reassure them. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, the question reverberated in his mind, echoing through the hollow space where his identity had once lived. Who was he? The children turned and ran, their laughter forgotten, leaving Matthew standing alone in the doorway. The house behind him seemed to exhale, the walls creaking, settling. The world outside felt distant, detached, as though he stood on the edge of something vast and unknowable. Slowly, Matthew closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking shut felt final, like the closing of a chapter. He moved through the house, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor, his thoughts drifting like autumn leaves. The mask, if it could still be called that, had fused to him entirely. There was no line between fabric and flesh, between who he had been and what he had become. As he wandered through the dim rooms, the whispers that had plagued him for so long were gone. The cloak felt like an old friend now, a part of him as essential as his skin, his bones. Whatever fight had existed within him had vanished. There was only peace, a strange, chilling peace that settled over him like the final hours of a long, cold night. The house, too, seemed at ease. The shadows no longer flickered with malice, they simply existed, as he did, quietly waiting. The reflection in the mirror showed only the cloak now, a dark, featureless silhouette that moved like a ghost through the familiar spaces. Matthew, or what remained of him, walked toward the front door again. He knew, deep inside, that the store was waiting for him. The Halloween night was far from over, and others would come, drawn to the strange little shop that appeared once a year, offering promises of transformation. He would be there, waiting, just as others had waited before him. The cloak would ensure that. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the faint sound of laughter echoed down the street, children running from house to house, unaware of the dark figure watching from the shadows. Matthew stood beneath the street lamp, the light casting a long, distorted shadow across the pavement. He watched the figures move in the distance, a strange calm settling over him. The wind rustled the edges of the cloak, and in the distance, the faint outline of the Halloween shop appeared once more, its crooked sign swinging gently in the breeze. He began walking toward it, each step deliberate, knowing that this was where he belonged now. The mask had become him, and he, in turn, had become the mask. There was no going back. The night was his, and Halloween had only just begun. The end.